All right, well, now that we see Mr. Slope Guy and all of his tattooedness, positive slope, up to the right. Negative slope, down to the right, hence the negative. Our undefined is when we have a vertical line, an up and down line. Let's put one other thing with this undefined here. When you have a line that goes up and down, it's not going to look like the rest of them. Normally when that happens, there's going to be something that says x equals, and there will be a number there. It's like if it's x equals 4, that might be an equation for an undefined slope. But if it's 0, if it's going side to side, that's going to be y equals in a number. Actually, let me put the number here too. Okay. And we'd started to talk about, when I actually remember to hit record, that this is the slope formula. And sometimes it may be written with an M. I've never been quite sure why they used M for slope, because there's no M in the word at all. But that's the way it goes sometimes. And the last tattoo we're going to give him, because we like filling up all of this stuff, is sometimes I may find slope in an equation, and it's always going to be that number in front of x. So everything you need to calculate slope, find slope, figure out anything with it is on here. I want to figure out something to put in the middle of his forehead. I've got to think of this for a minute. Got it. Got something for the middle of his forehead. And the other thing we do when we talk about slope is we talk about rise over run. And what that means when we're working through these.
I need student last name Campos.
So when we talk about rise over run, we're really talking about how much I go up or down versus how much I go right or left. Now that is one tattooed up guy. But again, keep this somewhere, whether it's in your folder, your backpack, whatever. You can use this when we get to like quizzes and things. Friday, we are going to do a mini quiz on stuff that we do with slope over the next couple of days. So this guy could kind of come in handy when we're doing that stuff. Now, we'll keep him handy just in case we need to use him during the notes here. Now we can kind of largen things back up a little bit so it's a little easier to see. I do. Yeah, no, we're in the middle of a lesson. All right, so when we're trying to find slope, and we just did some of this on Mr. Slope Guy's face anyway, okay, it's going to be my change in y. Always going to subtract my y values on top over my change in x. So when we're doing these, oh, control, we switch seats around. We're, let's see, row 3. Yep, he's got this. He's close. He's closing in. Oops, one more row over that 4th seat there. Yep, one more up for me. Perfect. Perfect. So, what we're going to do is we are going to be talking about how do I find slope, and there's lots of ways to do it. So we're going to talk about some of them today. So whenever we get an equation like the y equals equation, the one that we talked about here when we were on his face, that's always going to be the number that's next to the x term. So if it says 4x, it means the slope's 4. If it says the slope's negative 2/3, that's what my slope's going to be. So whenever I'm doing these, whenever I'm trying to find slope, all I got to do is find that number in front of x, and I'll have my slope. But here's one additional thing I want you to do. Slope is always easier to do, especially when we're drawing, if we make it a fraction. So if it's just a whole number like this, how can I make any whole number a fraction? Yeah, just put it over 1. So whenever I see slope, I'm always going to write it as a fraction, because it's going to make it easier when it comes time for me to go ahead and graph these. So like for letter B, what would my slope be? Yeah. It's the number in front of x, which was negative 3, but again, we want to keep making it a fraction so we don't forget about it. Now, if it's already a fraction, I don't have to worry about it as much. But in this case, that's what we're going to be doing for this. Okay, what about C? We won't do all of these, but we'll do a chunk of them. Yeah, my slope for C would be 2 over 3. So that's what we're on the lookout for with these. Now let me find a couple that might be a little more interesting. What about D? Nicely done. If I don't see a number in front of x, it's 1. Or in this case, it'd be 1 over 1. Okay. What about E? Ooh. Close. Yeah. It's 1 over 2. Because again, if I don't see the number in front of x, it's a 1. And since it's divided by 2, it'd be like doing 1 over 2. Oh, let's see. Oh, that's something we didn't. Oh, we're going to be tattooing Mr. Slope Guy here in a minute. Thank you. Let's roll down to J and K here. Now, we didn't talk about this exactly. I'm going to pull this down for a second, see if I can fit Mr. Slope Guy in here to help us out with this a bit. Okay, so we talked about how with Mr. Slope Guy, it's y equals in a number. My slope is going to be 0. So when I see something like J, where it says y equals 8, my slope is 0. And that seems kind of strange because you're like, well, I don't see an x anywhere. Exactly. Because that would be the equivalent of me writing this as y equals 0x plus 8. And the number in front of x would be 0. So that's why this one's going to be 0. Now the other one, that's a little more interesting. Because you look at K, and you're like, okay, here's Mr. Slope Guy. It says when it's x equals, and a number, it's undefined. So my slope, and I don't care if you just write like undef or even UND'd be okay. But you're like, well, why is it undefined? Why isn't it a number? Because you're like, well, x is there. Could it be 1? No, because that only works when it's in a y equals. When you try to do slope, and we'll see that in a picture here in a little bit, if you try to go up and over, there's no number to go over if it's a line that goes up and down like this. And that's why that doesn't have a slope. But we don't say no slope, we call it undefined. So always look for that number in front of x to get your slope. Now, it's not just equations. Sometimes it can be found in a graph. So sometimes by drawing a set of points along a line, because a line's just a bunch of points, you can count the units of change in the y direction. And again, that's your up and down. Of course, if you go up, it's positive. If you go down, it's negative. And then we use that for, fancy mathematical terms, the numerator, the top of my fraction. Okay, so the y's are always going to be on top. And then we also can count the units of change in what's called the horizontal, or the x. And again, that's going to be my right, which is positive, or my left, which is negative. And again, this is a note sheet too, so you're going to be able to use this on all the quizzes that we do. Just got to keep hold of it, so keep it in a good spot. And use that in the denominator, the bottom of my fraction. And the cool thing is there's not 2 points that I have to use each time. So for instance here, most of the time I'm going to be nice and put the points in for you. But I can choose any of the 2 points to count for my slope. You're like, any two? Any two. So like if I decide that I'm going to use these 2. And remember, when I'm doing slope, I do my up or down number first. So I'm going up 1. And I'm going right 1. I could do 1 over 1. Now some of you may say, but wait a minute, if you said I can use any 2 points and do it how I want, what if I decided I was going to go this way instead? Because then it's not going to be positive, because to get over to here, I would go down 1, and then I would go left 1. And I would agree with you. But what happens when I do negative divided by negative? I get a positive out. So it's still going to come out the same way. So there isn't a wrong way to go. And that's what you've got to concentrate on doing with these. So again, any 2 points. So let's say we decide to go this way. Now before I even start, Mr. Slope Guy can give me a good hint. Check out the direction the line's going. Looks like it's going down to the right. If I look at Mr. Slope Guy, down to the right's going to be a negative slope. So I know before I start, this better be a negative number, because otherwise I did something wrong. So what's my rise? What's my up and down number going to be? Negative, well, my rise first. Your run, you're good there.
3.
Down 3. So my rise is negative 3. Now my run, it looks like I'm going right 1. Is that positive or negative 1? If you go right. Positive. And that makes sense, because negative 3 over 1 would be a negative value, and it should be, because it's going down to the right. And again, any of these, choose any pair. Let's say, I don't know. You're like, what if I don't want to even do the 2 that are next to each other? What if I want to do like these 2? Is that okay? Yes, they do not have to be in a row. As long as I do my up or down first and my left or right second, I'm good. So like here, because I'm going up and over, so I go up 2, which is positive. And I'm going right 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I go right, that's also positive. And I've got this to look back at if I'm not sure. Now here's the one thing though, if I don't use the ones that are right next to each other, does anything divide into 2 and 4? Can I reduce that at all? Maybe? Possibly? 2 does. So I divide each of those by 2, because I always want to put it into its simplest form. Now, so we've seen here we can do it graphically. We can do it from an equation. And now what we're going to do, as you can see, we're getting the calculator out here. Maybe. If I can move the calculator. There we go. We also can be finding it if there are 2 points. And this is the one we're going to hit a whole lot for the next couple of days. So here's what I would suggest doing with these. At least at the start for some of you. Before I start putting them into the formula, my x is always going to be the first value in each one. My y is always going to be the second. And I've got to keep those straight, because if I mix them up, this all gets messed up. So once I get them labeled, go back and I say, okay, y's go on top. All right. And it doesn't matter what order I do them in, because I know it says 2 and 1. Wherever I start for y, I got to start for x. So does anybody have a preference if I start with 3 or 8 for y? Start with the 8. I'm good with that. So if I do 8 minus 3, and it's always minus, the only thing I have to be careful of is I have to start with the x in the same point where I started with y. Since I started with the 8, I got to start with the 4. And then I just do these. Now, I can do this in the calculator. That's not a problem. I can even do it all at once in the calculator, but here's what I've got to remember. If I'm going to go to the calculator, I got to use parentheses with these. Otherwise, I'm not going to get the answer that I want, at least. The calculator won't mess up. It just means it's something we've got to work at some. Now, here's the one thing I don't want. Do not write 2.5. Don't do it. These need to stay in fractions. So if you're going to go to the calculator and you get a decimal, just do math, enter, enter. Now, To be perfectly honest, do I think you need the calculator on that? No. 8 minus 3 is 5. 4 minus 2 is 2. Not that big of a deal. But if you want that comfort in knowing that you've got the right answer for sure, that's fine. But I do want to see that you're writing this out for right now until we played with it a little bit. So I'm just going to keep labeling my x's and my y's. And again, it doesn't matter which order I start in as long as I'm consistent. I like getting my minuses in so I don't forget them. So we can do like last time. We can start with the second y and then go to the first one. And we can do the same thing with the x's. Again, I start with the same one that I started with y's. So then, what I'm going to do, 1 minus 0 is 1. 6 minus 5 is 1, and that's as far as I can go with that one. And that's okay. The place I start to get nervous, though, is when we get the negatives working here. Once the negatives start working, then I worry that people are going to forget about them. We can't forget about them. Sorry, let me get these labeled one more time here. All right. So I look at these, I'm like, ew, better get my minus in right away so I don't forget. I'm just going to keep going with the second y each time. So negative 1 and then 4. And now you might see why I put the minus in there. Because even though it's a positive 4, I might be tempted to put plus otherwise, but it's not. And then my x's, 3 and negative 2. And again, I like the parentheses with the negative there because it's going to help remind me of something. So let's see how this works out for me. Anybody know what negative 1 minus 4 is? Negative 5. And then what happens when you minus a negative? Yeah, it becomes adding. Here's the one time that it actually becomes plus. So 3 plus 2 is positive 5. And like we've talked about before, if I can reduce it, and both of these are divisible by 5, I need to do that because that's going to make it simpler on me when it does come time to be able to graph something. Okay, so if I can reduce, I need to. I want to do one more with negatives here. All right, let's go down to E. One more with negatives, and I think we'll be good. Label up my x's and y's quick. All right. Let's see here. Get my minuses in right away. Second y, so 6. And negative 1. And for my x's down below, negative 3 and 4. As long as you stick to the formula and just take your time with it, not a big deal. We just got done talking about this minus and negative thing becomes plus, or you could type it in your calculator that way, 6 minus negative 1, get the right answer out. Negative 3 minus 4 is negative 7, and pretty similar to up in C, and it won't happen every time, it won't reduce every time, but just happens to here. They're both divisible by 7. And I get my slope found. So basically what we found here is we can use 2 points to find the slope, we can find a graph to find the slope, we can use an equation to find the slope. Let's see if there's any other weird ones here on the back. Oh, there is no back. Whoo. Okay, so notes are done. Again, let me bring this down. Use on quiz. There's another smiley face. He's a little happier than Mr. Slope Guy is.
You need that right there.
I sure can. We'll get Mr. Slope Guy back up here too in a bit.
Oh, well.
And get him up to have you ready to go too. Because now what you can do, you've basically got examples of everything in order to be able to work on the homework sheet. And Colby, I'll put this back up in just a second. I just want to make sure that I get this for those of you that are trying to jump to it. Notes will pop back up in a sec. This practice slope sheet, okay, make sure I get this right. So homework check 11, number 2. Okay. all you're trying to do in all of these is find the slope. Now, some of you may say, okay, 1 through 8, we got examples. I get that. But I don't remember seeing anything with a table like you have in 9 through 12, and you'd be right. So here's what that is in disguise. These are all coordinate points. You're like, well, wait a minute. We're only given 2 coordinate points before. Why are you giving us 3? Sometimes tables will do this. So here's how you're going to handle that. You're going to pick 2 of the points. We're going to ignore the third one. So like, let's say you're like, I like the positive numbers. I don't want to deal with this. Okay? I'm going to forget the other point exists. And I'm just going to work this out like I was doing the last ones we were doing in the examples. So like here, get my minuses in. Okay. Here's my 2 y values. So let's say I start with the second one. So I'd have 3 minus 0. And then I'd do the same thing with my x's. Start with the same one that was in with y, so start with the 1. And do minus 0. And then I just write the answer down. 3 minus 0 is 3. 1 minus 0 is 1. And I'm good to go. So don't let the table thing mess with you. It's not a big deal. But that's how that one would work. And then basically it's the same thing on the back. It's just figuring it out from the graph and doing a few with 2 points. Basically, that's the whole deal. Okay? So that's what we're going to do on these. And then cool.